Hello, everybody. Welcome to this talk. Curtis Poe will be talking about bringing modern object-oriented programming to Core.
Todd, thank you very much. I'm just going to go ahead and launch right into sharing my screen, and I hope everyone can see that.
Yep.
Good. Okay, so this is about putting an OO in the core. I spelled that C-O-R. That is not a typo. So I'm sure most of you folks know who I am. My name is Curtis Poe, better known as Ovid to many of you. I'm with allaroundtheworld.fr if you need excellent training, consulting, mostly in Perl, but we also do a lot of front-end work with Angular and other things like that. So if you need expert help, we only hire top-notch developers who've passed our programming tests and structured interviews. We're very good. You can also connect with me on Twitter, Ovid Perl, or if you want to email me, it's ovid@allaroundtheworld.fr. We're based in France, so that's the name. We're also responsible for cowstation.space. If you ever want to check that out, it's still an open alpha, so it's got some rough edges. It is a free-to-play MMORPG with the back end written entirely in Perl, and it doesn't cost you any money, and it's unlike anything else you've ever played before. So it's got a bit of a learning curve. So, but I am here to talk about Core, and the motto of Core is good enough is not good enough. The reason that is the motto is when I first started Core, I just wanted modern OO in the Perl core. However, after a while ago, I found out about the Perl 7 project and was talking with Sawyer about this. I decided to up my standards a little bit. Instead of getting something that was good enough for Perl devs to want to switch over to, it had to be better than what the alternatives are. The name Core, by the way, is short for Karina. The poet Ovid wrote many poems about this woman that he was madly in love with. So if you want to refer to this as Karina instead of Core to disambiguate between the Perl core, that's perfectly understandable. And some people say the name's terrible because it's confusing with the Perl core. Don't worry about that. The name's going away. This is just a name I picked to have something to talk about with the project. So Ovid was from Italy. So I want to talk about pizza for just a moment. You love pizza. You want to open up your own pizza joint. You're in a small town and they've already got a pizza joint. So how do you attract new customers? So as some of you know, I love economics and I've read quite a bit about economics. And one of the things that I've discovered is economists are pretty much under agreement that one of the worst things you can do is offer a sale. Because if you have something which costs $20 and you are offering it for $15, you've mentally reset people's perception of the value of the item. So when I used to sell cars, one of the things I discovered is my customers who paid the most money for their car were the happiest because they were sold on value. So price versus value is a very important concept, which I'm going to get into for just a moment, but it sounds a little strange to talk about in an object-oriented talk, but I want you to understand where I'm coming from. Why do people want to learn Perl? Perl has a steep learning curve. That is the price you pay for learning it. Rust has a steep learning curve. Rust is one of the most loved languages out there. It provides tremendous clear value for the sort of people who work in problem spaces that Rust deals with. What is the value that Perl provides for our steep cost? It's not available jobs anymore. The market has been shrinking for that. We're lucky, we still get new contracts developing new Perl, but I know a lot of other companies have been struggling with this. Data science and AI, they're really hot. Everyone wants to get into them. We don't offer much in that space. There's the CPAN testers framework, which is phenomenal. We've got excellent Unicode support. We have the best regex engine available out there. But these are all marginal value things. People don't go into a language generally because it's got a bunch of anonymous testers or because it's got great regex support. Instead, they go into a language because it provides them with some sort of value that they really, really appreciate. And if you look at job adverts for Python, Perl, PHP, Ruby, the primary space that we compete in, every one of those, because object-oriented programming is optional, what happens is they say must know OO PHP, must know OO Perl, etc. So OO becomes a value at that point. So what sort of value are we offering there? So a new developer comes along. They want to learn Perl. How do I write OO in Perl? That's a very natural question. So how does the conversation go with a new developer? Well, first you use the CPAN client. Excuse me? Okay, that one's not too bad because we're used to installing things with various tools from different languages for grabbing stuff off GitHub, whatever. Okay, fine, but installing something that seems like it should be built into the language seems odd, but that's fine. We can deal with that. Now you need to pick an OO system. What? No, seriously, just pick one. But not that one. Okay, fine. So they go ahead and pick their OO system. And the build fails after about 15 minutes. They have some sort of obscure error message which says got undef expected empty string, and they don't understand what the heck that means. Okay, just force the install. This is an embarrassing experience. Everyone wants OO. Well, not everyone, but lots of people want OO. It's wide value. But there's a steep learning curve to even install it in Perl, much less trying to figure out which OO system you're going to choose. We have too many competing OO systems. It is a mess. So one of the biggest values we can offer, we don't offer. By the way, when we're talking about price versus value, less is not the value you are looking for. I want to make that extremely clear. If you like Bless, that's fine. For most of you, for many of you, Bless is fine. But Bless, that's kind of like an assembly language for OO. You've got to wire everything together by hand. And the more code you have to write, the more bugs you're going to write. We know that. The Moose family of languages changed everything. This has become more or less the de facto standard for what OO is in Perl today. But it's not in the core, which leads to the obvious question. If we want to offer this high value, what should be in the core? So good enough isn't good enough. Most of the OO systems out there on the CPAN, they're not complete. And basically they're a sugar layer for getters, setters, and the constructors. We're treating objects like structs. We're not doing object-oriented programming. If you're just using, data objects, like kind of like the core of what you would see from many ORMs, that makes sense. But for a lot of the true power of object-oriented programming, just having getters and setters and a clean constructor, that's not enough. But that's kind of mostly what we're going to focus on in this talk, because that's the primary thing that people can appreciate. So it's not enough to be good enough. You have to be better than. This is tremendously important. If we're going to provide value, it is not that we provide value better than what Perl was. It is value which makes them say, I would like to use this more than, say, the Python object system. By the way, if you're familiar with Python 2 objects, they're terrible. They're rubbish. But Python 3 actually does a much, much better job of this. So we want to offer something that makes it easy, but allows you to build big, powerful systems. And you don't have to worry about how to install it, whether or not it's there. It just is. And then there's this mess. This is an NYT prop of where I was trying to debug some performance problems for one of my clients. And virtually everything here was related to the mop in Moose. This is terrible. OO systems of Perl tend to be slow. So core. We want modern OO in the Perl core. We want it to be easy. You can get up to speed very quickly. It needs to be more powerful than most of the languages out there. A lot of the stuff we can do potentially with types and definitely with roles gives us that ability to do that. And we're trying to figure out the MVP. The MVP, minimum viable product, that's hard to figure out which features really give us more power and which can be put off to version 2. But it still needs to be Perl. I don't want to rewrite this into a different language. So I've got a grammar which describes the overall structure of how core looks like. It's not intended to be perfect, but it's to give us a starting point for discussion. Here's a grammar just for how the methods would work in core. And one thing to keep in mind about a grammar, though, is it tells you how the tokens are laid out in your code. It doesn't tell you anything about the behavior of the code. So this is just part of what we need. So I want to talk about some of the design considerations, first of all, so you can understand where I started from. Easy things should be easy and hard things should be possible. This is Perl in a nutshell. This is a mantra we've had forever and a day. But I'm pushing it a little further. Small systems should be easy to build. Large systems should have greater safety. This is still easy things should be easy and hard things should be possible. There's nothing revolutionary about that. I am trying to break up some of the problems we have with Moose, Moo, and things like that by decoupling the data, we call them slots, the methods to access that data, construction arguments, trying to separate all of that out so they don't get too convoluted. I'm trying to encourage smaller interfaces. I'll mention that more later. But if I'm going to provide value, I need to cater to new developers. So I mean new to Perl, but also new to programming. So for example, in Moo, you have has name is RWP. What the heck is RWP? It's read write protected. I don't know what that means. And if you're new, that's going to be something which is potentially a little bit harder to remember. In Core, it just has name and it has reader. That's simple. So it has no writer. So I've got a name, and you can read that name from the object if you want to. So that's what I mean by catering to new developers. So you might remember Paul Graham, when he created ARC, he designed that to cater to experts. And he built up that language, and a lot of people got excited that is going to be the 1,000-year language, but it was only designed to cater to experts. The problem was it provided so little value. The first version was ASCII only, if you might recall. Rust also caters to experts. It's not easy, but it provides tremendous value. Today, ARC is pretty much dead. I've checked the boards where they post messages about it. There's nothing there. ARC is nothing. It caters too hard to experts and doesn't provide enough value for the general public. So Core, it's very opinionated. My opinions, sorry. It's very Perlish, and it's designed to be practical. By practical, I mean it's easy to write, easy to read. So Sawyer is very receptive to the idea. It is likely, once we have enough of the spec done, that Core will be in Perl 7.2 or Perl 7.4. And it'll probably have a feature guard like use feature class or something like that. Stevan Little, he's writing a transpiler. And that gets interesting because a transpiler can target different versions of Perl and can remove those features which Perl might already provide, which means if he hits his goal, you might be able to write Core back as far as 5.8. Awesome. Paul Evans is working on Object Pad, which is kind of a version of Core that's available now. It's not quite the same thing, but it's already shown some very interesting things about it. We do need more community input. You can go out to ircperl.org/core, or you can go out to github.com/ovid core wiki, and you can read up on the entire spec there. I've left issues so you can leave comments on the different portions of the spec. And I want to make clear that the syntax you're seeing, we've mostly nailed down the syntax, but there are some corner cases. So some of this is going to change. And data types are shown for entertainment purposes only. There's a lot of issues around data types that we are still trying to nail down. But I want to talk about the evolution of OO and Perl, just so you can get an idea of the contrast. But I'm going to start with Moose, because Moose is pretty much one. So Moose 0.01 was released in 2006. This is a very simple bank account object. We had to use strict and warnings back then, but this mostly looks like the Moose you would see today. But here's a point object pulled directly out of the original Moose documentation. You've got has X, is an int, is RW, you write, and declare self X0, which means you can write to those directly. It's kind of odd if you want immutable objects, but that's fine. But Stevan Little realized that there were a lot of mistakes made in Moose. Despite how good it was, there were a number of problems that had to be done. So he's trying to write Moxie, which is a way of trying to get closer to pushing the OO into the Perl core. And this is what point would look like in Moxie. You declare your slots, we have default values, and that's it. It is completely decoupled from other things, not entirely, that's still coupled with constructor. And then you have the accessors down here, which I think the syntax is unfortunate. And then this syntax is just Sorry, Steven, to me, that's terrible. Try to explain that to a new Perl developer, that's just gonna be a nightmare. This is the same thing in Core. Has XY, you can optionally pass it to new. It's got a reader, each of those has a reader, and default values, if you don't pass it to new, are 0 and 0. And the clear method, you just assign 0 to the variables. There's Moxie on one side, there's Core on the other. Every time I rewrite any sample code in Core, it is smaller and easier to read, and quite often more functional than the corresponding code in Moose or Perl. And this is a problem that I have banged my head over again, time and time again. Moose handles data declaration, attributes, types, coercion, delegation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You want to talk about an overloaded function? This is terrible. So what does Core have for has? All it does is data declaration. That's it, nothing else. It says, here is a piece of instance data available for my class. So let's look at a simple object so I can give you some more concrete examples so it's not just theoretical. We've got a customer object name, birth date, optional titles such as Dr. or Ms. or something like that. We have customer methods. So we can get the full name, which is a name with the title prepended if it exists. And then we ask, are they old enough to vote? Are they old enough to drive, etc. And in Moose, it might look like this. We've got our title, name, and birth date slots, and then we've got the methods down below. This looks familiar to everyone. We've declared the title, name, and the birth date as read-only because we don't want mutable objects. Now, what does this mean? So I have a guard for the section of code. If Ovid is old enough to vote, and then I try and set Ovid's birthday to yesterday, and that throws an exception because it's immutable. This means you cannot set the birthday into an invalid state for the section of code that you put this old enough to vote guard on. But date is still mutable, which means you can set the year to last year, and now Ovid is no longer old enough to vote in this section of code, which is supposed to be guaranteed that I am old enough to vote. This is not a theoretical problem. So Ricardo Sinius wrote a brilliant blog entry about the real problems he had debugging problems with mutable state because objects are all references. So this bit of code over here changes a value in an object. This bit of code over here, which has the same reference, oops, that's going to be a problem. So datetime moonpig and datetime x immutable have been released. And this is such a serious problem. I actually, for my latest client, I wrote a DBX class component called immutable datetime. I won't go into the details, but basically it means when you're using DBX class, you can now inflate your datetimes to immutable objects, and you don't have to worry about nasty surprises later on. So thank you very much to SysPete for helping me figure out that code. So Core guiding principles, has name reader. Immutability should be the default, absolutely. But Core doesn't want to take anything away from you. So if you want to slap a writer on there to make it mutable, you can do that. There are a few extra characters you have to type because I don't mind offering a few extra characters to make you stop and think, should I be doing this? So we got a new business rule. Customers must always be addressed by their title plus name if title exists, never by just their name. Because for whatever reason, you know, maybe doctors get upset if you don't call them Dr. Jones. So we've got this full name method in our customer class for Moose. And here's what it might look like. Full name is title, self-title, blah, blah, return title, concatenate name. So we can say customer full name, which is what we want. But if we say customer name, that fails. That's a bad idea because it might violate our rule. So how do we fix that in Moose? We want the name attribute to be private, but we don't want to pass underscore name to new because we usually make things underscore to say they're private even though they're not. So one way to fix that is with init arg. I discovered a lot of Moose developers aren't familiar with this. Init arg says, okay, I've got my underscore name attribute, and I'm going to pass init arg name to this, which says when I call it in the constructor, I'm actually going to initialize this using the name key, not the underscore name key. So now when you call customer name, you get a method not found error. So you've got a little bit of safety. I work in a lot of client code bases, and this is what I see all the time. Customer underscore name. Yes, they will call your private methods. How can you stop that in Moose? Moose is very flexible. It It will find a way, trust me. And here's how you do it. Is, you can pass bare to is, which means it has no reader, it has no writer, but I can still pass it in the constructor. But then how does my code inside the class read name? Well, I call self meta get attribute name get value self. Simple. Nobody does that. Nobody does that. So init arg and bare, these are really clever solutions, but they're clumsy, and a lot of this has to deal with the fact that when Moose and family were written, these were the tools you had available. So it was constrained by what we could do with the Perl language. So they weren't bad design decisions. They were simply, this is the best of a bad situation. And part of the problem also is because has tries to conflate state plus methods plus object construction, and it's a mess. How would you solve this in Core? So, well, first of all, as a pro tip, when you're writing a class, don't provide any public data methods. Don't let anyone read your data directly. You only provide needed behavioral methods. And if you have to expose the state, do it on a case-by-case basis. Don't just by default give everyone all of that, because now your contract's a lot bigger, and if you realize later on you shouldn't have exposed the name attribute, now it's harder to pull that back because you already have done that. And it's kind of painful to do this in use. So a guiding principle, two new guiding principles of Core. Private data should be very easy to define, and we don't encourage promiscuous data. Basically, don't make this available outside of your class unless you need to. So here's my customer class written in Core. You'll notice for name, title, and birth date, I don't have a reader or writer assigned for any of those. I can pass them into the constructor if I want to, and now for method name, I return title, and if it exists, then I can concatenate title and name with the space. Otherwise, I just return the name. It's simple, it's easy. There's no tricks. There's no hoops you have to jump through. So let's talk about attributes a little bit more. So some methods are expensive to calculate, but what if they only need to be calculated once? And this is very often the case if you have immutable objects. Then what do? You don't want to call the method every time and have it recalculated. So in Moose, you can use attributes. And I apologize. I know the word attribute is getting very, very overloaded here, and it's going to get even more overloaded later on. But basically, imagine you've got your box class. You've got height, width, and depth, and you need to calculate the volume, which is height times width times depth. This is fairly lightweight to calculate. Pretend, for the sake of argument, that it's very heavyweight and you only want to calculate that once. How do you do that in Moose? I've got a volume attribute. I've declared it as read-only. I don't really need to assign a type to this because I'm just returning it, and I know internally it's fine. And init arg is undef because I don't want someone to be able to pass volume into the constructor. It's lazy because I need it to be calculated after I know my height, width, and depth have been defined. And then I have a builder called build volume, which is return self times height times width times depth. Nobody does that. Nobody jumps through those hoops. That is too painful. They're just going to recalculate the volume every time. And if that's an expensive function, it becomes painful to fix that. That's how you do it in Core. It has volume, declare that it has a reader and a builder, and then build volume, height, width, and depth. For builder, if you don't assign the immediate attribute, that means the builder is automatically lazy, and it's calculated once and only once, and it's easy to do to solve this problem that we have. So side by side, you can see Moose is on your left, Core is on your right. You can see Core is a lot shorter. It's a lot easier to read. There's less stuff to remember in order to figure out what it's doing. And because the names are descriptive, you can generally understand what's going on. But I want to talk about object construction a little bit. So this one gets a little frustrating for Moose. So first of all, so Core, I have two variations of the new attribute. If I have just :new, that means this attribute must be passed to the constructor. If I have new optional, then it may be passed to the constructor. It's absolutely not required. By the way, if you want it to be passed under a different name, there's a :name attribute, which allows you to rename that, but I'm not covering that right now. So that is there in case anyone's wondering. So that's how you declare things get passed to an object constructor. So in Moose, I've got my height, width, depth. I've got a box which has my height, width, and depth passed to it. Now I say my box volume, it's 21. Great, that's fine. What if I want to have a special case, a cube? Well, height, width, and depth are all the same, so I want to be able to pass a single argument to the constructor. How does that actually work? Well, first thing you do is you go to the Moose docs to remember how to write BUILDARGS, because I can never remember how to write BUILDARGS. So I write an around method modifier. If 1 equals number of args, then the number, the length of the side, is arg0, and then I pass in, then I reconstruct my argument array, and I call the original version of BUILDARGS. And now I've got a 1, I can pass just a single number into the constructor. But this is going to fail, because in Moose, you can pass a list of key value pairs, or you can pass a single href. And you're going to get this weird error. Attribute depth does not pass a type constraint because blah, blah. What the heck is going on with that? So actually, I have to check if I have one and only one argument, and if that argument is not a reference. And even this can be overly simplistic depending upon how crazy you want to get with the constructors. And this is a pain. And actually, this is what I did. I'm so embarrassed by this. With all my clients, if I have to write a BUILDARGS, I have this magic voodoo line noise I put at the top. If args equals, if I only have one argument, then I've got my post deref arg0 or args and blah. That's shameful. So here's how they do it in Java, in case you're curious. They actually have a constructor overloading, method overloading. You just declare the constructor more than once with 3 arguments or only 1 argument, and it's just dead simple. This has the problem that, like you can see for this first example, box 3, 2, and 3.5, you don't know which of those is height, width, and depth. Named arguments are a much better solution, but it works. It's very easy to overload your constructor. So look at Moose, look at Java. Java, famously verbose, is shorter and easier to read than Perl. We don't need that. We don't need that. So the downside, as I mentioned, you can't tell which of those is the height, width, or depth. It's harder to read. What does Cor do? So I apologize, I borrowed a term from Raku. We have phases of object construction, and this is the construct phase. So we have a construct phaser. I would like a better term, but fine. Construct, if I have 1 argument, then I just remap my args and I return the args done. It's that simple, it's that easy. You don't have to remember any sort of arcane syntax for this. And I particularly want to thank Graham Knopp for beating me over the head, because my original work with construct was terrible. So we have a construct phase. This is what happens before everything is initialized. So you can rewrite your arguments on the fly. We don't call it BUILDARGS because the semantics are not the same. So there's Moose on the left, your BUILDARGS, and that funky line noise you have up there, and then there's Cor on the right. Much easier to read. Or you can punt and you can just declare an alternate constructor with class and num, and then it becomes easy. So we can sidestep that entire mess if we need to. So core guiding principles, make object construction easy. I worked very, very hard on that, and I hope I got it right, but there will be cases where I did not. So let's look at classic Perl 00 right now. This is if you like bless, this is how it worked. Now, some of you may remember a long time ago, when we blessed a href, we would put underscores on the attribute names. Why did we do that? Because we were saying, if you reach inside these objects, these are the private ones you're not allowed to touch. That's okay, I'm not gonna go there. Basically, we've got a name and a birth date. They're both read-only. So I've actually put a little guard in there. So if you try and pass a value to the name or birth date methods, that they will blow up on you. In Moose, this is so much easier. You just declare each of them as read-only. Now you can declare the types. It's much easier to do. You can say they're required. Because you don't have a builder, that means that you will have to pass them in the constructor. And then you've got this magic make meta immutable at the bottom, because you can't tell when an object class is done defining itself. So but still, that's much better than Cor Perl. And there's Cor. Oh, let me try that again. I accidentally hit the wrong button. Okay, Are we back? So there's Core. I've got my name. It's got a reader. New means it's required in the constructor. I've got a type, birth date, reader, new, and a type. Much simpler, much easier to write. So we can compare Core to Core Perl, or Karina to Core Perl, and you can see how much simpler and easier that is to write. It's very fast, and it gives you a lot of power in just purely declarative code right there. So many of the object systems I see in the CPAN, they're just public methods for data, which is the wrong thing to do. You don't want to expose all of that data right up front, because you want to keep the smallest interface possible so you have the freedom to change the contract, the method contract later. There's an old saying, the open close principles. Classes should be open for modification, or open for addition, closed for modification. And by having the smallest interface possible, that makes it easier. Moose, unfortunately, practically requires public methods. It's hard to avoid that. And everybody and their dog wants public methods. So they're writing these things all the time, but they want these simply because it's so hard to declare that data internally in objects in Perl the way it's currently structured. So core guiding principle number 5, attributes for data should just be easy. And I've made them easy. Here is a real example, cache LRU, least recently used cache written in core Perl. You can't see it because it's so much code, it's harder to read. So the font size is a little bit bigger here for Moose. That's a little bit easier to read. And then there's core. Very little code required for that. Almost all of it's declarative, and we only have to write one bit of actual procedural code, which is the set method, which handles invalidating things in the cache, basically. So very simple, very easy. So if we look at this later, we can see I've got non-lazy default. So instead of having a builder method, I can have equals time, and that gets evaluated immediately, assuming the value isn't passed in the constructor if it was required. You can see I've got my private data right there. That's my cache variable. That is not available outside the class. It's private. We've got this max size, which is an optional value. I can specify the number of elements I'm allowed to have in my cache, and it's optional to be passed to the constructor. I've got a reader, so now you can read how many elements are allowed. We assert a type, which is a positive integer. And then you can see I use it later on in the method where I'm gesturing at my screen, and you can't see that. So I'm using the method just as a max size variable. Again, it's all nice private. It's nice. It's encapsulated. And it's easy to read.
First, it took so much time to do some.
Pardon? Okay. So, by the way, this is very similar to Raku. I wrote the same thing in Raku. I was a little bit curious about this. This didn't actually work because it turned out the ordered hash was actually sorted, not ordered, so it didn't work. But this is a structure of what it would look like in Raku, in case anyone's curious. It's very, very similar. So what is has, though? What does that function do? It's kind of like my, in that it declares a variable. Actually, I think our is a little bit more appropriate description. It's a lexically scoped and bound to that particular namespace that it's in. And all it does is declare the variable. We have attributes to add additional behavior. Optional to the constructor, we've got readers, builders, whatever. These are all the slot attributes that we currently have defined. Readers, writers, builders, constructor arguments. We can declare them as weak if we need to. If it's a builder, you can say it's immediate, which means it's not lazy. We have clearers, predicate methods, handlers in case you want to do object delegation. You've got a name in case the name of the slot variable is not appropriate for the name that you expose outside the class. And right now, we actually only have one illegal combination. When you put all those attributes together, a builder and default is kind of like a shorthand for a builder, which is immediate. If it weren't for that, there would be no illegal combinations of those attributes. But I put that in there just to make it easy for people to be able to do this. So I did this to make it very, very hard for you to write a slot and assign behavior in a manner that is actually illegal or invalid. That took a lot of time, but I think it's pretty close to it. So Core should support types. You notice a number of references to them. That might not make it into the first version, but I think that's going to be disappointing because I do think that's one of the features that we will need to make this better then. So if you are familiar with Python 2, I've asked in Python 2, you know, I've got a date time and I want to make sure that I'm assigning a date time object for that, you know, attribute and not a string. How do I validate that? What's best practices? And Python 2 developers say, oh, you don't validate your data. That's unPythonic. You should just know how to use your data. I've got a million line system. I can't check this for every single class that I'm in. So Python 3, like I said, does a much better job of that. So I think core supporting types should be important. It would be a runtime check, but it should also be optional if you don't want to use them. There's some questions about the syntax of types, which I won't go into right now. So the work that we have in this, so Sawyer has been discussing some ideas with me. Like I said, Stevan Little's been working on a prototype, a transpiler, so you can use the older versions of Perl. And Paul Evans, his work with the object pads really interesting. So I did some benchmarking on that. Object construction's a little bit slower, but without him doing any optimization, it actually runs, after the construction, it runs faster than Core 00 does today. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. So you can go out to CPAN and check out Object Pad to see how it works. It is very similar to Core. He's experimenting with some ideas which go beyond Core, other things that he wants to play with, but this has been a great test bed to see how these things actually work. Note the method in there. If you use method instead of a sub, the Perl will know it's a method, and you'll automatically get a $self variable in there, which quite often you won't have to use unless you're calling another method inside your class. So again, very simple, very easy to use. So the objections I've gotten to Core. I've got to address those because I think they're important. So if bless was good enough for my grandma, that's probably not very nice. No, if bless was good enough for Perl for so long, why do we need something new? Nobody's proposing removing bless from the Core. If you like bless, that's fine. Just keep using it. That's perfectly fine. We're not trying to restrict you, and we understand sometimes blesses can be perfectly appropriate. So why not moose or moo in the Core? Now that one gets be a little bit more interesting. So when talking about moose has a whole lot of dependencies, which means all those dependencies would get slurped in the Core. We'd have to spend a whole lot of time rewriting a lot of those dependencies. Only one person suggested moose in the Core. Moose is big and it's slow and it has a lot of the wrong defaults. But moo, a lot of people discuss moo, so why don't we want moo in the Core? Moo is very light, it's very fast, it's wonderful. Moo's also got a meta method. If you call make immutable on meta, that's a no-op. If you call any other valid meta method, then all of a sudden moo is doing a whole bunch of things, either building a mop for you or possibly inflating your class to a proper moose class, to a full moose class, which means if you put moo in the Core, you either have to pull moose into the Core or you have to tell everyone currently using moo, it's not forward compatible, your moo code might break. But more than that, moo has things like RO, RW, RWP, and lazy. So you can't really separate the reading and writing of attributes very easily. And these are the wrong defaults because all of them provide a reader for your data, which you don't necessarily want read. And it makes the RWP with read write protected, that gives you a reader of foo and a writer of underscore foo, but that's not private. And we would like this data to be private if possible. So good enough is not good enough. Basically, no one builds something great by striving for meh. Yeah, it's okay. We need it to be better, and that's very important. By the way, if you've followed the Core work so far, you know that I've oversimplified some things. I punted on a lot of things. So I want to apologize for that right now. A lot of people say, why don't we just make it a module? Just put that module out there on the CPAN. Oh yeah, that's a great idea. So now which object system am I going to choose? And then we've got the standards problem that XKCD referred to. So situation, there are 14 competing standards, 14 ridiculous. We need to develop one universal standard that covers everyone's use cases. And the situation is that there are 15 competing standards. The proliferation of OO modules on the CPAN is terrible. It really makes a confusing mess. And when I go into clients, one of the problems clients talk about is it's taken our developers so long to get up to speed because they've written their own ORM, they've written their own object system, they've written this and that, so many things that many of which could be part of the core language, probably not an ORM though. But object system, definitely, that would make Perl easier to learn and reduce the burden for a lot of companies that want to use Perl. So the elephant or the camel in the room, Perl 7. So this will probably go into Perl 7, but it's going to have a feature guard. I don't know what the name of the feature is going to be. I don't think we can call it use feature core because that's going to confuse the heck out of everyone. So use feature class is my proposal. And then you get this class, cache LRU, you've got all the syntax there. And then the intent is that in Perl 8, you no longer have that feature guard. Use Perl 8 and boom, you have core. So we'll just get rid of that little guard. Why should we stop there? What else can we do? So imagine we have this new scope syntax, module, sum module. This is backwards compatible because this would be illegal in older Perls. So you can do anything you want to in that syntax space. We can have type signatures. Now, to be fair, Dave Mitchell's already working on type signatures, so that's probably going to go in there. If we wanted to have multisubs, we could put multisubs. In this case, it'd be based upon the number of arguments to a function. And this really solves a number of unusual cases that people have. But what I would love to see at some point is type signatures and multi-methods, because this really solves a lot of problems in OO code about how you divide things up. But I'm not going to go into detail on that because I know that's extremely controversial. What about typed variables? My total is an int. Now, this is part of the reason why types are problematic. So in this particular case, this is going to be a runtime check because we don't know what get total is going to return. But you'll notice the type definition in the signature has a different syntax. So we don't want to have declaring types in different places, has to use different syntaxes because. So that's something we're going to have to work on. So core in the core, basically it ends the embarrassment of how do we do OO. That goes away. It's already with object pad, we're seeing this as being significantly faster than core Perl, not just moose or moo. Standard OO becomes easy to learn, easy to explain. And if we get roles in there and if we get them done right, if we get the type system built out correctly, this will be better OO than many of the other dynamic languages out there. You know, we'll probably start with use feature class. It sparked a lot of interesting ideas, but we have to be careful to get this right because this is going to be core. Cor V2, we don't know what we're going to do. Native exceptions, try catch finally. That one's problematic because it turns out to be very slow. Async await, I'd be almost interested in that in V1. Getting true private methods available, maybe multi-methods, types, maybe that'll be V1, we don't know. We don't know what else might be in there. So basically core, it's clean, it's simple, you get real methods, we're decoupling the data that accesses the object instruction. We're trying to figure out what the MVP is going to be, and that's the hard part. And specifying, of course, how the exact semantics of a lot of the behavior, and I've skipped over a lot because I don't have the time. And how extensible can we make it so that it is the basis for you to build new great things on. So that is it. I don't have any bonus slides, so I know we don't have much time, but if you have questions, I am happy to take them. Todd?
I'm here.
Okay.
First of all, thanks a lot. It looks like we have two people with questions. Let's start with David.
So my question is about inheritance, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to just tell me to shut up that question before I even get to it.
Okay, quick. We don't have much time.
Okay, sorry. So the question is basically private methods, private data. Will those be visible to descendant classes, to classes that inherit? Great, cool.
Yeah, generally, no, they will not be. Also, a word about inheritance. The thought is the first version of core might be single inheritance, and then we could get multiple inheritance later. Al, I just saw your question on Slack. Yes, we're looking at a mop for it. Protected, will there be protected methods? I'm not planning on that now. Protected methods, that's an idea from Java where you have something available in a parent class and it could be inherited from subclasses, but it's not available outside the class. We are not looking at that at the current time. There's some questions as to whether or not that's actually a good idea.
Okay, Devin?
Okay, yeah, I emailed you about this and you responded as if I was suggesting you put Moose in Core, which was not. What I was asking is, why not, instead of inventing a new syntax, why not just try to use either the Raku syntax for its OO system or some subset thereof?
Okay, the Raku works great for Raku. One of the biggest problems we have right there with a number of the things is that in Perl, lists and hashes flatten. They don't in Raku, unless you tell them to flatten, which means there's a lot of problems with semantics about how things would be declared. So I've been looking at like, how can I do has at array? That doesn't actually work quite as cleanly in Core as I had hoped that it would. And plus, a lot of the syntax in Raku is significantly different. And I also don't like some of the decisions they made, how they declare the data for a class and how that can get exposed outside of the class. So you'll notice that a lot of what I did looks very similar to Raku, but there's enough differences designed to make classes safer and easier to use for larger systems.
It would be a way to avoid the 15th competing standard thing, though.
That is possible, but if you looked at my slides for comparing the cache LRU in Raku and Core, you'll see they're very, very similar. They're not that different, but Raku syntax is significantly different enough from Perl that it doesn't actually work.
Okay.
Okay, Darren?
Yes, I'm happy to see privates. I think you said you had that. Something I'm hoping that can be built in early is the analogy to that several languages has and Perl 6 calls trusts, where it's something that's private to everybody except other classes that you name. This is a very valuable feature for multi-class APIs, and Java and C# and whatever also have their analogies called internal or package scope, and I think it would be great to include that, probably modeled after Raku, like trusts. Okay,
so having trusted methods would definitely be a V2 feature at this point. Trying to figure out what our MVP is going to look like. I agree that trusted methods could be valuable. If you want to comment on the Core Wiki, just open a new issue for it, that's fine. Especially if you have a proposed syntax and the semantics attached to that syntax with some use cases, that would be great because it would allow us to evaluate that much better.
I was also thinking trusted attributes, assuming you have private attributes.
No, all attributes at this time are intended to be private, and then you would expose them with all slots are private, and then the attributes that you assign after the slots is how you actually expose them.
Not a problem. Thank you.
Okay, Mark?
Yeah, so one thing that I see as a regular issue with the way we do a lot of Perl OO is roles conflate code composition and safe code composition with defining interfaces and behavior. And so, you know, it's one of the things that I'd like to see, I'd like to hear you address.
Okay, so roles, for those not familiar with them, they're like subsets of behavior that you can share across unrelated classes. And roles have, keeping it simple, they have two primary components. They have behaviors they provide, methods, and behaviors they require, which are methods. And I didn't touch roles because I didn't have the time in this talk. But basically, the behaviors that you require, you list a list of required behaviors. That's called an interface. We already have that built into the role, but I can't take that out of the role because if a role has a list of behaviors that it requires, it has to list the behaviors that it requires. And breaking them out into a separate interface class for something that is internal to this role and only this role, I don't see the value in that this time. And it looks like it might be overcomplicating the system for something that it's harder for me to understand the value of, because roles have to provide that. They have to say, these are the behaviors I require.
Yeah, I guess the thing is with a role, you know, you may like alias the particular methods. Like I need to have a thing that provides this capability, and you could communicate, like call this method to get it when you specify a role. But, you know, I hear what you're saying. Thank you.
You're
Okay, I don't think we have any more questions, but I'll bet you anything Curtis is going to be in Slack and can answer any questions in hallway if anybody has them. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for speaking, Curtis. And
Thank you. It was a blast.